The document they handed me on my 18th birthday was not a gift, but a deed. It was my only inheritance from a grandfather I barely remembered, a man my stepfather called a fool and my mother never spoke of at all. The paper felt thin and brittle, a final, flimsy link to a past I couldn't grasp. That same afternoon, my stepfather pointed to the door, his face a mask of grim satisfaction. "You're a landowner now," he said, the words dripping with a sour irony that curdled in the cold air. "Go live on your land," and so I went, with nothing but a canvas sack holding a change of clothes, a loaf of bread, and my dog, Kaiser, whose warm, solid presence against my leg was the only real thing in a world that had just dissolved. The land, when I finally reached it after 2 days of walking, was worse than a fool's legacy. It was a curse. It was a hillside of tombstones. An army of pale, splintered stumps marched from the valley floor to the ridge, a silent testament to a massacre of trees. The air, which should have smelled of pine and damp earth, carried only the dry, dusty scent of decay and failure. A small, derelict cabin slumped near the crest, its roof sagging like a tired old man's shoulders. This was it. This was my kingdom. Kaiser whined softly, pressing his head into my hand as if to ask if this was truly our destination. I knelt, wrapping my arms around his thick fur, and for the first time, I let the cold dread wash over me. I was 18 years old, utterly alone, and the owner of a dead hill. My inheritance wasn't land, it was a graveyard. The wind, the only living thing with any voice up here, whispered through the stumps, a long, mournful sigh that seemed to echo the emptiness inside me. I had been cast out, sent to preside over a wasteland, a final, cruel joke from a world that had never wanted me in the first place. That first night, huddled in the dusty ruin of the cabin, I found his journal. It was tucked inside a loose floorboard, wrapped in oilcloth. The leather cover was worn smooth, the pages filled with a cramped, spidery script that was difficult to decipher in the flickering light of the single candle I'd brought. It was my grandfather's hand. At first, the entries were just observations of the weather, notes on soil composition, sketches of birds I didn't recognize. But as I turned the pages, a story began to unfold. It was not the story of a fool, but of a visionary. He hadn't just been living here, he had been conducting a great and secret experiment. He wrote of a species of conifer he'd found high in the northern ranges, a tree he called the stone pine for its resilience. It grew slowly, its wood incredibly dense, its needles retaining moisture through the harshest drought, its roots capable of gripping shattered rock and drawing life from it. He believed these trees could reforest the arid, overlogged lands of the West. He had spent 20 years cultivating them, crossbreeding for strength and adapting them to this specific hillside. He wrote about the logging company that had come, the one that had paid him a pittance for the timber rights before he understood what he had. They had clear-cut the entire hill, taking his life's work and leaving him with this field of stumps and a broken heart. They took the parents, he wrote on the last page, his handwriting shaky and thin, but they did not find the children. That was the final entry. The children. A thrill, cold and sharp, cut through my despair. It wasn't a lament, it was a clue. He had saved something. He had left something behind. I spent the next day searching, Kaiser digging excitedly beside me, convinced it was a game. I tore up floorboards, checked the crumbling chimney, and explored the small root cellar. Nothing. Defeated, I slumped before the cold hearth, tracing the lines of the great, flat stone that formed its base. My fingers caught on a small, almost invisible carving near the back, not a letter, but a symbol. A tiny, perfect pine cone. It took all my strength, but with a rusted iron poker as a lever, I managed to shift the stone. Beneath it, nestled in a hollow lined with dried moss, was a small, heavy chest of dark iron. It wasn't locked. I lifted the lid, my breath catching in my throat. It was full to the brim with seeds. They were small and dark, heavier than any pine seed I had ever seen, and they felt cool and smooth in my palm, like river stones holding the memory of cold water. He had left me the children. He had left me a chance. The work was a kind of prayer offered to the dirt. Each day began before sunrise, the air sharp and cold in my lungs. My first task was to deal with the stumps. I had no horse, no blasting powder, only my own 2 hands, a shovel, and an old axe. I couldn't remove them, not entirely. They were too deep, their roots like grasping claws in the rocky soil. So I dug around them, chopping away the gnarled fingers of wood, clearing a small circle of earth around each one. My hands, soft from a life of indoor chores, blistered, then bled, then hardened into calloused leather. Kaiser would lie nearby, watching with an anxious tilt to his head, occasionally nudging my arm with his wet nose as if to remind me to rest. After clearing a patch of land, I would follow the next set of instructions in the journal. My grandfather had been a master of the soil. He described how to build its life back after the trauma of the logging. I gathered ash from my fire, collected fallen leaves from the sparse thickets in the valley below, and mixed them into the pale, lifeless dirt. I hauled buckets of water from the creek a half-mile away, my shoulders aching with a fire that never quite went out. The people from the town of Prospect Creek, nestled in the valley below, soon noticed the lone figure toiling on the barren hill. They saw me as a curiosity, then a fool. The town's most important man, Mr. Hemlock, who owned the mercantile and half the valley, would sometimes ride by on his fine horse. "You're trying to farm granite, girl," he called out one day, a smirk on his face. "Nothing's grown on that hill since the loggers salted it, and nothing will again," his companions laughed. I didn't answer. I just plunged my shovel back into the unyielding earth. Their scorn was just another kind of weather, another hardship to be endured. It couldn't touch the fierce, quiet hope that was taking root inside me, a hope born from those small, stone-like seeds and the words of a man I was only now beginning to know. My world had shrunk to the sacred space between one stump and the next. Dig, amend, prepare. It was a rhythm. A promise. The first winter was a trial by ice. The wind howled over the naked ridge, and the snows came early, burying the cabin and my painstaking work under a thick blanket of white. I survived on dried beans and the few rabbits Kaiser managed to catch, my world reduced to the small circle of warmth cast by the hearth. Doubt was a constant companion in the long, dark nights. Mr. Hemlock's words echoed in my mind. Maybe he was right. Maybe I was just a fool, tending a graveyard, whispering encouragement to dirt and ash. But then spring finally broke, a slow, muddy thaw that unveiled the hillside once more. The soil I had worked so hard to prepare was dark and damp. And then, one morning in April, I saw it. A single, tiny spear of green, no bigger than my thumbnail, pushing its way up through the earth beside a weathered stump. I dropped to my knees, my breath catching in my throat. It was so small, so fragile, yet it was an act of impossible defiance. I searched the rest of the cleared patches, my heart pounding. There was another. And another. In all, 17 saplings had survived the winter underground. 17 small flames of life against the vast emptiness of the hill. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. That small victory changed everything. It silenced the doubt. It turned my labor from a hopeful gamble into a sacred duty. Over the next year, my work took on a new intensity. I built small stone walls around each sapling to protect them from the wind, and wove crude fences of fallen branches to keep the deer away. My life was governed by the needs of these 17 fragile lives. The townsfolk continued to watch. My solitary, relentless work had made me an outcast. They called me that stump girl, but one afternoon, a man walked up the hill. It was Owen, the town blacksmith. He was a large, quiet man with soot permanently ingrained in the lines of his hands. He didn't say much. He just looked at my broken shovel head and the axe handle I'd clumsily repaired with twine. "Leave them by your door," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I'll fetch them tomorrow." I tried to offer payment, but he just shook his head and walked away. The next evening, the tools were back, the shovel head welded stronger than before, the axe fitted with a new handle of smooth, balanced hickory. There was no note, no request for payment. It was the first act of kindness I had received in over a year, a silent acknowledgement that my work, however strange, was real. The years began to blur, marked not by calendars but by the slow, steady growth on the hill. Year 2, the 17 saplings were knee-high. Year 3, they reached my waist. Year 5, they were taller than I was, their slender trunks beginning to thicken, their needles a deep, healthy green. I had cleared more and more of the hillside, and each spring, new shoots appeared. The 17 became 50. The 50 became 200. The graveyard of stumps was slowly, imperceptibly, being hidden by a rising tide of new life. My world was the hill. I knew the feel of its soil in every season, the exact way the light fell on it at dawn and dusk. I learned the language of the trees, the slight curl of a needle that meant it needed water, the way a branch would reach for the sun. Kaiser grew old beside me, his muzzle turning grey, his pace slowing, but his vigil never wavered. He was the silent keeper of our shared secret. The town of Prospect Creek mostly forgot about me. I was a fixture, a permanent part of the landscape, as unremarkable as the rocks themselves. The stump girl had become the pine witch, a strange woman living alone in her thicket of odd-looking trees. Only Owen remained a quiet presence in my life. Every few months, I would find a sack of flour or a block of salt on my doorstep, left sometime in the night. We never spoke of it. It was an unspoken pact, a recognition of a shared understanding of hard work and perseverance. I saw him in town once, when I went to trade a few skins for supplies. Mr. Hemlock was holding court in the mercantile, complaining about the thinning timber in the valley. Another 2 hard winters and we'll be burning fence posts, he declared. He glanced at me as I entered, a flicker of disdain in his eyes. Unless we want to try burning that witch's weeds up on the ridge, his cronies chuckled. I ignored them, traded my skins, and walked back up my hill, but his word stayed with me. They saw weeds. They saw a thicket. They had no idea what was truly growing here, the dense, resinous heartwood forming within each trunk, the quiet miracle unfolding under their very noses. The air on my hill was different now. It smelled of pine and resin and damp earth, the scent of life returning. By the 10th year, the change was no longer subtle. It was a transformation. My hill was no longer barren. It was covered in a dense, vibrant forest, unlike any other in the valley. The stone pines had grown into their legacy. They stood close together, their branches interlocking to create a thick canopy that kept the soil beneath moist and cool even in the heat of summer. Their trunks were straight and strong, and their needles were a shade of green so dark it was almost black. The ecosystem, starved for so long, had come rushing back. Birds I'd only seen in my grandfather's journal now nested in the branches. Rabbits and foxes made their homes in the undergrowth. The wind no longer howled over a desolate ridge, it whispered through 1,000 living branches, a sound like a river. The town could no longer ignore it. Riders would stop at the bottom of the hill and just stare. What had been a scar on the landscape was now the only truly green place for miles. The mockery had faded, replaced by a grudging, bewildered respect. They still didn't understand what they were looking at, but they could not deny its existence. Owen came up one evening, not to leave supplies, but just to look. He stood at the edge of the trees, his hands on his hips, and let out a low whistle. "I'll be," he said, shaking his head slowly. "You did it. You really did it." I had never heard him string so many words together. "My grandfather did it," I corrected him gently. I just listened. He looked at me, then at the forest, then back at me. A slow smile spread across his face. "Well," he said, "you're a good listener." That winter, the whispers began. The autumn had been unnaturally dry, and the first snows came with a biting, relentless cold that settled deep into the bones of the valley. The other forests, the ones they had logged for generations, were thin and sparse. The wood they yielded was light and airy, it burned fast, giving off more smoke than heat. People were burning through their winter stockpiles at an alarming rate. They started looking up at my hill. They looked at my dark, dense forest, and for the first time, they didn't see weeds. They saw warmth. They saw survival. Then came the great winter. It was not a season, but a siege. The cold was a physical presence, a predator that stalked the valley. The creek froze solid, all the way to its muddy bed. The snow fell without stopping for weeks, piling into drifts that buried fences and blocked roads. The world became a silent, white prison. Inside their homes, the people of Prospect Creek began to feel the cold creeping in. Their woodpiles dwindled to nothing. The cheap, fast-burning pine they had harvested from the valley floor was no match for the relentless frost. Sickness followed, a dry, rattling cough that took hold in the young and the old. A desperate quiet fell over the town. The usual sounds of life, the ring of Owen's hammer, the laughter of children, were gone, replaced by the constant, mournful cry of the wind. Panic began to curdle into despair. They had been proud, self-reliant people, but the winter was breaking them. They had stripped their own lands bare, taking the easy wood first, never thinking of a day when the supply would run thin. Now, that day had come. From my cabin, nestled deep within the protective embrace of the stone pines, I was warm. The wood from a single fallen branch could keep my fire blazing hot for a whole night, its dense, resinous core burning with a steady, clean heat that filled the small space with a comforting glow. The trees acted as a natural wall, blunting the force of the wind. The snow lay thick on their branches, but the ground beneath was not as deeply frozen. My grandfather had designed a forest to withstand a siege, and it was doing its job. I watched the smoke from the town's chimneys grow thinner and thinner, until one day, there were only a few pathetic wisps rising into the grey sky. I knew they were in trouble. I knew they were suffering. And I knew they would have to come to me. The thought brought no satisfaction, only a deep, quiet sorrow for their short-sightedness, and a heavy sense of the responsibility that was about to fall upon my shoulders. They came on the coldest day of the year. A small group of men, their faces gaunt and wrapped in thin scarves, trudged up the path I had worn into the hillside. Mr. Hemlock was at their head, though he walked without his usual swagger. His fine coat looked thin and inadequate, and his face was pinched with a mixture of cold, desperation, and humiliation. Owen was with them, his expression grim and steady. They stopped a few yards from my cabin, the silence broken only by the crunch of their boots on the snow. Kaiser, old and stiff but ever watchful, let out a low growl from the doorway. I put a hand on his back to quiet him and stepped outside. For a long moment, no one spoke. Mr. Hemlock stared at the thick, healthy trees surrounding him, then his eyes met mine. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a raw, pleading desperation that was far more unsettling. He began, the word catching in his throat. He cleared it and tried again. We need wood. He gestured vaguely at the valley below. We're freezing. The children. People are sick. We've got nothing left to burn that's worth a damn. His gaze fell to the ground, unable to meet mine any longer. Your trees. They look strong. I looked past him, at the faces of the other men. I saw farmers whose land I knew, men who had likely laughed at Hemlock's jokes about the stump girl. Now, their eyes held no mockery, only a desperate, fearful hope. They had come to beg for the lifeblood of the very thing they had ridiculed. A part of me, a small, cold part that remembered the sting of their scorn, wanted to refuse. I wanted to tell them that this was their own doing, the price of their own greed. But then I looked at my forest. I saw the towering pines, a testament to one man's foresight and a decade of my own faith. My grandfather hadn't created this place for himself. The journal was clear. He wrote of community, of legacy, of creating a resource that would sustain life, not just for one person, but for all. He had been building an ark, and the flood had finally come. I let the silence hang in the frozen air, letting them feel the weight of their request. This was more than a transaction, it was a reckoning. When I finally spoke, my voice was calm and clear, carrying easily in the still air. You don't need wood, I said. They stared at me, confusion warring with desperation on their faces. Mr. Hemlock looked up, a flash of his old anger returning. What in God's name does that mean? People are dying. It means, I continued, my gaze steady, that if I give you wood, you will be warm for a week. But you will be cold again next winter, and the winter after that. You have been taking without ever giving back. That is why you are freezing. You don't need wood. You need a forest. I stepped back and picked up my grandfather's journal from the table just inside the door. I held it up. This is not just a thicket of weeds. This is a system. It was designed to last for generations, but only if it's treated with respect. If you clear-cut this hill like you did the rest of the valley, you will kill it. And you will have learned nothing. I looked directly at Owen. I will help you. But not on your terms. On the forest's terms. Over the next hour, standing there in the biting cold, I laid out the plan. It was all there, in the last chapters of the journal. A method he called for selective harvesting. We would take only the mature trees, the ones marked by a certain thickness of trunk. We would never take more than 1 in 10. For every tree cut, 2 new saplings, grown from the seeds I had carefully collected each autumn, must be planted in its place. We would use the whole tree, the trunk for firewood, the branches for kindling, and the needles for mulch to nourish the soil. It was not a handout, it was a pact. A contract between them and the land. They would receive warmth, and in return, they would become guardians. There was murmuring. Some of them looked skeptical. But Owen stepped forward. "She's right," he said, his voice cutting through the grumbling. "We were fools. We cut everything down and wondered why we were left with nothing. It's time we learned a better way." He looked at me. "Tell us how to start." That day marked the beginning of a new season for Prospect Creek, one that had nothing to do with the weather. Under my direction, the men of the town learned to walk through the woods with new eyes. They learned to see the difference between a tree that was ready and one that still needed time. They learned the heft of a sapling, the feel of the soil, the quiet patience required to plant a new life in the earth. Owen became my lieutenant, his practical mind and quiet authority turning my grandfather's theories into an efficient, respectful operation. He organized the teams, ensuring the rules were followed to the letter. Mr. Hemlock, humbled and stripped of his authority, worked alongside the others, his silence a testament to his transformation. He learned to swing an axe not with the brute force of a logger, but with the precision of a caretaker. The valley was saved. The dense, hot-burning wood of the stone pines warmed their homes and broke the fever's grip. They survived the great winter. But more than that, something fundamental had shifted within them. They had been given more than firewood, they had been given a purpose. The forest on my hill became the heart of the community, a shared responsibility and a source of collective pride. They no longer saw a witch's thicket, they saw their future. They saw the living result of foresight and faith. My solitude ended, not because I left the hill, but because the valley came to me. They brought me supplies not as charity, but as a tithe to the forest's keeper. They brought their children to help plant the new saplings, teaching them the pact their parents had made. My grandfather's legacy was finally fulfilled. He hadn't just wanted to grow trees, he had wanted to cultivate a different kind of human spirit, one rooted in stewardship instead of conquest. I still live on this hill, with a new dog now, a descendant of Kaisers, sleeping by the hearth. The forest is stronger than ever, a testament to a balance struck between humanity and nature. And sometimes, when I look out over the valley, I think about the barren hillsides we all inherit in one way or another. The landscapes of loss, of failure, of ridicule. The places that others tell you are worthless. What you must understand is that nothing is truly dead. Every stump holds the memory of a tree. Every patch of barren ground is a canvas waiting for a seed. The greatest work you will ever do is to find the children that have been left behind, the hidden potential, the secret hope, and give them a place to grow. So, look at your own desolate hills. Look at the graveyards you have been given. And ask yourself, not with despair, but with a quiet and determined hope, what will you plant there?